Such films as The Crazies, Martin, Dawn of the Dead, Night Riders, Creepshow, Day of the Dead, Monkey Shines, The Dark Half, and Bruiser.
I grew up in New York, in the Bronx, multi-ethnic family, no money or anything, just a kid in the Bronx, parochial schools. And my dad was a commercial artist. I was always interested in film, and I had an uncle, the only guy in the family that had any bucks. And he was the first guy to buy a little 8mm camera in the old home movie days. And I used to take the camera out and mess around with film. So I actually made my first little film at age 11 called The Man from the Meteor. And I thought we were doing little theater, you know, hey guys, we can have the show right here. And I never went beyond thinking that I could make a little movie and glue it together, splice it together, and show it, you know, to the neighbors. As it was playtime, you know. It was like let's put on a show. The way kids say, well, let's try to put on a rock show, or let's get a rock band going, or let's do a musical, or whatever. And that's what it was, with absolutely no idea that there was any sort of a professional future in it for me. You know, I was just playing around, you know, the way kids play soldier or whatever.
After studying art, theater, and design at the Carnegie Mellon Institute in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Romero got a production job with Fred Rogers on the Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood television series, shooting a segment called Picture Picture. This led to other work, producing and directing commercials and industrial films in the Pittsburgh area, where he decided to make his permanent home. The growth of his small company eventually led to the production of Night of the Living Dead. The film became a landmark cult film and a significant social document. It was a stark parable of the American family consuming itself and had many influences. Among them, the EC horror comics of the 1950s, the gore exploitation flicks of Herschel Gordon Lewis, and Alfred Hitchcock's film, The Birds.
The company that we started in Pittsburgh was called The Latent Image, and over the years, we accumulated equipment, lights, cameras, and sound equipment. We were pretty much a self-contained shop, which is why we were able to go out and actually finish a film. We made Night of the Living Dead. We started on, there were 10 of us, and we each kicked in $600 and bought some film and rented the farmhouse and started to shoot in between beer commercials and industrial films. And we'd go up to the farmhouse and shoot for a couple of days, and finally managed to finish it. Once we were able to, we couldn't raise money. I mean, we would tell people, we're going to make a movie. Oh yeah, in Pittsburgh? Give me a break over here. And finally, when we were able to actually show a couple of edited sequences where the sound was in sync with the lip movement, and so people looked at it and said, hey, it looks like a movie. And we say, yeah, that's what we were trying to tell you. So we were able to raise 70 grand and finished the film on $70,000, owing another, 44, something like that. And threw it in the trunk of the car, literally. Drove it to New York to see if anyone might want to show it. I mean, it was that simple. That was it. Everyone struggled through it. Everyone stuck with it. None of the actors quit on us. I mean, there were no protections going either way, contracts or anything like that. We were just a bunch of people that were getting together and making a movie. And we just lucked out that everybody stayed with it and gave it their heart, and we managed to pull it off. I think there's several underlying themes in Night of the Living Dead that are people's inability to communicate. I mean, the protagonists are in a situation that they could probably easily solve if they would stop fighting among themselves. They cause their own downfall. They don't really address the problem because everyone has a different perspective on it and they can't bring their views together. So I do think that, pettiness and, well, in some cases not pettiness, in some cases, whether it's religious or ethnic or whatever, tribalism causes people keeps people from the end goal. I do like to use those themes. There are also, the thing that I was working with foremost in my mind was the idea of a revolutionary society taking over and literally swallowing, in this case, literally swallowing the outgoing civilization that doesn't even realize it's being overcome. And that's really the theme of the 3 zombie films that I did on some social, on a socio-political level. But when I say I'm not a message filmmaker, people have written about these films and say, well, if you really look deep underneath, you'll find these things. And I don't think they're deep underneath at all. They're sort of right there in your face, right up front. And there are themes that are in the script and right up front. But first and foremost, these are horror movies. They're thrillers. I mean, if horror tales or apocalyptic tales are supposed to be just that, they're supposed to be about upheaval and turning things on their head. And yet, traditionally, everything works out in the end. In most of the stuff that you see, it all comes back to normal. Well, when what you're the whole reason for doing the piece is to kick normal in the butt. And I never quite understood why you want to bring things back to normal after you've upset the apple cart that much. I think a couple of things about Night of the Living Dead. First of all, its grittiness and its apparent, as I say, in many ways, unwarranted political, the unwarranted political sub-themes that are read into it just because of when it was made. I think the film took on an importance that wasn't really all there, or certainly not created by us. Number one, I think that the fact that it didn't flinch and push the envelope a little bit on the, rather than cut away when somebody gets bitten by a zombie or torn apart by a zombie, that sort of opened the doors as well. Again, that was, partly an aesthetic decision, but I wouldn't have been able to do it if there was an MPAA at the time. And, so there again, it's a little bit of luck. They say you got to have that a little bit of luck. Mainly, I think it was one of the first, other than the big, obviously you could say all the big Japanese monster movies are anti-nuke movies. You could say a lot of the stuff in the 50s and 60s, or the stuff that immediately preceded Night of the Living Dead, was all the, the fear of science. There was always that theme underlying. But nothing really went deeply into the societal whole, or nothing was really very, very much of a socio-political satire, if you will. And so I think that's partly why the film got recognized. Not that I was the first to do it, or that the film was the first to do it. I mean, I facetiously say that I ripped it off from Richard Matheson. I mean, his book, I Am Legend, does the same thing.
Romero's next film was the 1972 release of There's Always Vanilla, a sometimes shocking look at 70s sexually liberated cool. That same year saw the release of Season of the Witch, which dealt with a bored, unhappy suburban housewife mixed up in witchcraft and murder. Then, in 1973, Romero released The Crazies, a story of biological weapons gone awry in the little town of Evans City, Pennsylvania.
In my mind, I didn't think that The Crazies was particularly, it's sort of peck and paw, like gory. It's not a fantasy film. I mean, I've gone overboard in the zombie films. It's become, I think, part of the shock, or part of my inclination to be shocking. If it were up to me, I wouldn't draw the line anywhere. I mean, obviously, you'd have to restrict it somehow. I mean, I didn't make those films for kids. You know, they're not The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. I know Roger Ebert originally wrote a piece that was reprinted in Reader's Digest about going to see Night of the Living Dead at a matinee, and all these terrified kids that went screaming from the theater. And, you know, it was before the MPAA rating system. And, you know, we didn't make the film for them. And but that, you know, it was shown on an open bill, probably with, you know, some very benign horror film, or, you know, some old Hammer thing, or I don't know.
You will not enter my room!
You will not take family blood.
There isn't any magic. There isn't any magic. It's just a sickness.
Nosferatu.
In 1978, Romero did for vampires what he had already done to zombies with the release of Martin. It was a surprisingly moving film with a sense of humanity, and was more like a melancholy fairy tale than a horror film.
Martin is not realistic in that I can't believe that this kid exists and is talking to the radio talk show and that it's really happening. So to some extent, it's a parable, yeah. Which is also why we wanted it to be a little larger than life in visual style rather than naturalistic or gritty. That's what it is. It's a parable. It's not meant, and as far as I'm concerned, he is, you know, he is the melancholy Dane, or, you know, somebody who's doomed because whatever forces have made him into what he is have made him into something evil. And the stake is going to get you, whether you're a vampire or not. Stake in the heart will do you in. So yeah, it's an exploration, and he keeps. I mean, what Martin's point is, there is no magic. I mean, and he confesses on the radio talk show, and nobody listens to him. And his grandfather doesn't listen to him, because his grandfather believes that he's got the family curse, and he's a real vampire. You know, the beast comes from somewhere, not only within the kid, but from within all the people that have influenced him on his way growing up to the age that he is. And so it was the beginning of my playing with those Jekyll and Hyde themes, and starting to get the media involved, and the church. There's a few things that I like to take jabs at, if I can figure a way to write a scene that'll, you know, let me sort of get out one of my pet peeves. I try to find a place to do it.
Well, his movies are truly scary, and which is very hard to do, let's face it. There's a creepiness to them, and they always work on another level, too. They're not just sort of stupid, scary movies. There's always something deeper and darker there.
Shoot it, man. Shoot it, man. Shoot it in the head.
Romero's second production in the Living Dead trilogy was Dawn of the Dead, released in 1978. He shot the movie in a real shopping mall in the winter of 1976, with a week's reprieve during the Christmas shopping season.
For years, I resisted doing a sequel to Night of the Living Dead. I mean, part of me was paranoid about being pigeonholed in as a horror guy. I've always loved the genre, and I grew up on it. I grew up on EC comic books, but you know, when you want to be a filmmaker, you don't say, hey, I want to be a horror filmmaker, or I want to make jungle movies, or I want to make war movies. You want to make movies. And I was afraid of, you know, getting pigeonholed by the industry as just strictly a horror guy, which has happened. But back in those days, I thought I might be able to resist by trying to do other kinds of things. And then it was 10 years later, and I actually had this kind of conceit. The original Night of the Living Dead was tied to such an angry time, 1968. The night that we drove the print of the finished Night of the Living Dead, literally, as I said, we threw it in the trunk of the car and drove it to New York. That night, while we were driving, we heard the announcement that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. So that's the time frame. And I think that a lot of the sequences in Night of the Living Dead with the posse and the rednecks and, you know, really were played into the, you know, the zeitgeist of that particular time, and having a African American in the lead, and so many things that made the film seem even more political than what our thoughts were, you know, about whether it's, people talk about this, wasn't the silent majority, but the idea of political revolution, media, and people's inability to cooperate. So a lot was read into it. And I started to think about that, and I said, hey, what is there about the 70s? How could I do a caricature of the 70s and set the next zombie film in that? And, you know, I decided it was all about rock and roll and splashy colors and consumerism and, you know, these shopping malls and where the kids were starting to hang out, and that it needed to be bawdier than the original film. And so that's really where it came from. I mean, I didn't start with a story of who's it going to be, what the character's going to be. I started with that. And we happen to know, socially, the people at Oxford Development that owned Monroeville Mall. And I went out there and I was taking a tour of the mall, and he said, you know, there are these rooms upstairs, and there's all this civil defense emergency supplies up there, and you know, you could survive up there and sneak down through the grates and get anything you wanted from down here. And I said, wow, there it is. So that was it. I said, wow, using that as the framework, I said, wow, this is perfect. I mean, people who are on the run, the world is in chaos, and they're on the run, and they happen to land on the roof of this shopping mall, find these little rooms up top, and decide, man, we got everything we want, and just fall into the trap of, you know, of the possessions and the home and that life being what they want to defend instead of their lives or civilization or society in general. They wind up, you know, holing up in this consumer cathedral.
The keys! Stephen, the keys!
Come on, man, get out of there!
Keep him, Stephen, just keep him.
Don't let yourself in there.
The problem that we had with in using a real shopping mall, we couldn't afford to build a set. The problems that we had were mainly that we could only shoot at night, and that meant after there were taverns in there, they didn't close till 2 in the morning, and they let the cardiac patients in to do all-weather exercising at 7 in the morning. So we had from 2 to 7 every morning, and that was it, and it was a struggle. We would get all set up in these big conference rooms that they had and make the zombies up, and so that literally we were ready to roll right as soon as we could at 2 a.m. Again, it was a lot of luck. First of all, it was luck that we knew these people. It was extreme luck that they actually let us come in and do this to their shopping mall. And otherwise that film would never have existed, because you could never do it on, with construction and trying to recreate a set that big and that realistic.
Perhaps one of Romero's most interesting films came in the form of Night Riders, released in 1981 and starring actor Ed Harris. The film followed a traveling troupe of jousters and performers, with an obvious parallel to the classic tale of Camelot.
Definitely based on Camelot. I mean, there was the king who had a certain vision with this traveling troupe of players, his queen, who had a relationship with, or was attempted to have a relationship with one of my favorite knights. There were the dark knights and the good knights. There was a Merlin character who was called Merlin in the film.
Everybody here made a conscious adult decision to be here. To be with you. When you go crazy, you force them to rethink that decision. You've got to...
Compromise.
Change doesn't have to mean compromise. We're bigger now. Things are different. We've got an overhead.
Publicity helps the overhead by bringing in more crowds, more sucker-headed American driftwood that can't tell the difference between me and Jim Jones, or Charles Manson, or the great Walenda. That kid thinks I'm Evel Knievel.
That kid thinks you're Billy Davis, Sir William the Knight. You're his hero.
I'm not trying to be a hero!
Well, Night Riders, in fact, was from the very beginning, when I first thought of it, meant to be a retelling of the Camelot legend in contemporary times. And it really came, there was a group at the time called the Society for Creative Anachronism that used to run these medieval fairs. Now there are several groups that go around the country in the summers and have these Renaissance fairs where they joust and they sell handicrafts and all of that. And so that's where the idea came from. I said, well, what if this group was this group that was getting a lot of publicity because instead of using horses, they were jousting on motorcycles. That was the hook, that was the sales pitch if you needed to go do a sales pitch on it. But basically, it's about it really is a retelling of the Camelot legend. The disappointment that can come, and tragedy that can come from adherence to a strict set of rules, which, a lot of people thought the film was very egalitarian, and that Billy, the lead character, was a Nazi,
And Billy was a bit of a zealot. I think the first scene, he's like, whipping himself with reeds in a pond, trying to purify himself, and he gets a little carried away with his ideals. But not negatively so, but he gets to the point where he's gone as far as he could go with his ideas.
Where'd I leave my flashlight? You remember, Doc?
Never mind. Let's get this last name out of here.
You hear that? There's something in there, Doc. Something shiny. Looks like a couple of emeralds.
For the 1982 release of Stephen King's Creepshow, Romero assembled an all-star cast that included Hal Holbrook, Adrienne Barbeau, Fritz Weaver, Leslie Nielsen, Ed Harris, E.G. Marshall, Carrie Nye, Vivica Lindfors, and Ted Danson.
Martin, my vampire film, Martin, went to Sundance. And it was the beginning of, when the studio execs were all going to Sundance to see what was new and hot around the country. And a couple of execs from Warner Brothers saw Martin, and they had just bought the rights to Salem's Lot, Stephen King's Salem's Lot, the novel. And in typical studio fashion, they said, hey, vampires in a small town, maybe we should put these guys together. So literally, Warner Brothers sent me up to Maine. My wife and I went up to Maine to meet Steve, and we hung out for a couple of days. And I of course, immediately said yes to Warner's. As it turned out, Warner Brothers decided to do Salem's Lot for TV, so that didn't happen. But Steve and I remained, we stayed in touch. And even when we were going to shoot Night Riders, Steve said, hey, how about I come out and do a cameo? So Steve and his wife came out and did a cameo in Night Riders, and we hung out some more. And we started to talk about, I said, boy, we ought to just do like an anthology, a horror anthology thing. And he called up 2 weeks later and he said, here's the title. It's called Creepshow. That's the name of the comic book. And we'll do 5 stories, and then we'll do this little wraparound about a kid having problems with his dad because he's reading this trash. And that was it. I mean, within 3 weeks, Steve sent us the script. And a couple of the stories were based on things that he had previously published, short stories that he'd published, and a couple of them were originals. It was the first time that I got to work with, people that I had been, seen on screen forever. Leslie Nielsen and Hal Holbrook, Fritz Weaver, E.G. Marshall. I mean, these were all people that I just always admired. And, we were able to get them. We were able to afford to, make offers to them. And then Ted Danson, Ed Harris was in it, Adrienne Barbeau.
It might have been a difficult film for George because if I remember correctly, this was the first time he was working with a lot of Hollywood actors. And my assumption is there were a lot of personalities to deal with. He didn't, it's 5 stories with 5 completely different casts and probably some egos.
I felt like we were doing 5 episodes of Columbo, where they always had the big star, the Leslie Nielsen type star in the thing. And it was great fun.
And we were at a garden party with lots of people around. And George Romero had a shot of my character standing watching the garden party. And in his imagination, and they showed me actually do it, I pulled a big gun out of my pocket and aimed it at my wife and said, "Mary," bang, and they went, and put I loved that.
Wilma!
Your husband's calling you, Billy. Oh, God, Henry, what's wrong now?
Not a thing, Wilma. Everything's just fine.
There's one of the sequences in Creepshow is about cockroaches. It's about this sort of Howard Hughes type clean freak who lives in a pure white apartment, sealed off from everything. And he's this mega power guy, multi-millionaire type guy. And he gets invaded by cockroaches. We needed a lot of cockroaches. And when you buy cockroaches from a laboratory, which you can do, they cost 50 cents a piece. But when you need like 800,000 cockroaches, that runs into money. So we had a couple of entomologists from New York who literally went to Trinidad and collected barrels full of cockroaches. And they sent back photographs of them in caves, literally up to the waist in cockroaches, walking around in a sea of cockroaches. And they just packed them into barrels and brought them, and they brought them up here. And, they have to go through all of the, import and whatever, the quarantine stuff and everything. But the cockroaches had their own trailers. It had to be at a certain temperature. It was amazing. And more amazing than that was we were on a set, sealed off, and we had to seal it off so that they wouldn't get away. But you could dump out a Rubbermaid trash barrel full of cockroaches in the center of that room, and within 30 seconds you wouldn't see one. They got everywhere. When we took the telephone apart, there was this telephone-shaped thing. It was all cockroaches. Same with the computer. We had a jukebox on the set, and there were thousands of them in there. I mean, it was just, it was really creepy. The name of the story is They're Creeping Up on You, and they surely creeped up on us. But amazing things, I can tell you. If anyone needs to wrangle cockroaches out there, I got a lot of hints for you.
This was a man who knew what he wanted and how to get it. And it's a very relaxing thing to work with a director who knows what he wants and how to do it, instead of experimenting around and wearing the actors out with 20 takes, which really means he doesn't know what he wants and he's not prepared. But this director was prepared, and it was fun working with him.
think of George, I smile because he brings a smile to me. He's garrulous at times and a huge appetite for life, I think, and for work and for other people. I think he's a very brave individual and highly intelligent, and I just love him. You know, I think he's a great man.
Romero's final entry in the Living Dead trilogy, Day of the Dead, was released in 1985. Although a favorite of Romero's, the film was the least successful of the three.
You know, a lot of people think of Day of the Dead as the least successful of the three zombie films, but it happens to be my favorite for some reason. So much of when you think of the films that you make and you try to rank them in terms of what you consider them, how successful you think they are, so much of that is personality and the time that you had shooting it and the people and, you know, how much fun did you have and how much did you enjoy it. And a lot of it is that kind of nostalgia. And beyond that, there's something about it that I think is the most apocryphal, and you know, the idea that maybe these things are developing intelligence, and we have a scientist who's actually feeding them in order to try to develop that intelligence, and it's sort of, you know, really sinking to the hell bottom of the whole thing, and I like that about it. What did happen, the original script that I wrote, which I meant to sort of be the capper or the final one of the trilogy, wasn't producible. I mean, it was producible, but it would have cost like $7 million. And the people that were putting up the money said, hey, if we're going to spend $7 million, you got to promise me an R rating. And I wanted it to go out unrated again because I wanted the freedom to, you know, use this shock tactic of the gore, Grand Guignol. And so I wound up rewriting it on a much smaller scale, based around a location that exists here in Pittsburgh, which is this big underground limestone mine that we used as the headquarters for the main location for the film. And so maybe to some extent I had to do that quickly. And maybe there are things that I can't even see that are, you know, where the I's aren't dotted and the T's aren't crossed. It's still hard for me to look at it without enjoying it, though, because everything about it was such a good time. And I particularly love the score. And some of the actors are, you know, still really good friends of mine. And so it's, you know, I'm satisfied with it.
After the disappointing reception of Day of the Dead, Romero bounced back with the 1988 release of Monkey Shines. In this film, an experiment is performed on monkeys to increase their intelligence, but unfortunately, the results are not exactly what was expected.
Oh, hey. You don't like the beard? Gotta tell you what, neither do I. It's out of here, okay? Beard is history.
Listen, as a kid, I watched Night of the Living Dead, which maybe today is still the scariest movie ever. At the time, it was one of the first movies I'd ever done, this Monkey Shines. And I liked the script, I liked the part. I was excited to work with somebody like George Romero. So it was, to me, it really was a thrill.
There was a producer that I had known for years named Jerry Panessa, who was working for Charles Evans, Bob Evans' brother, and in New York. And they had purchased the rights to a book called Monkey Shines. And we're sort of sitting around puzzled and saying, how do we make a movie out of this? And Jerry, being an old friend, called me up and said, do you have a take on this? And sent me the book, and I read the book, and went to New York and met those guys, and we wound up working together and beat out a treatment on it and a screenplay. And Charles knew the people at Orion and got it financed. It was all pretty quick, actually. I mean, it came together pretty quickly. Undoubtedly because of Charles's clout. He'd just come off Tootsie and was being listened to at the time.
Thank you, Eva. No more foods. No more food, Eva. No more food. No.
The real star of Monkey Shines is a monkey. And it deals with a quadriplegic and who has a monkey put in his home. There's a real program called Helping Hands that trains monkeys to live with paraplegics, quadriplegics. And, they can serve you your food, they can turn on the music, turn on the TV, answer the door. And this is actually happening. And the monkeys are raised at Disney World. And then you can go and adopt one of these monkeys for 3 years because they want them to live in a home, preferably a home with a lot of activity for a few years before they put them in the program. A woman who had adopted one of these monkeys fell in love with it and wouldn't give it back. And so it still had teeth. When they place monkeys in homes with disabled people, they extract their teeth because they're not that reliable. And this monkey still had its teeth, and we needed a monkey that looked threatening, so we didn't want a monkey that was, coming around and be. So this monkey, who we expected would not be able to do any of the things required, just stepped up to the plate, and because of his relationship with the woman, she would be able to show him something to do. The monkey was a female. And the monkey just did it. And that monkey wound up doing 90% of the stuff in the film. The toughest thing about, I think, doing any sort of an animal picture is you really have to have a storyboard either on paper or really locked in your head, because you can't have the whole company sitting around while you're trying to get the monkey to, put a cassette tape in the player. So you really need to know what size shot you want, which way the monkey has to look. You have to remember all your lighting setups, and then you go and shoot the monkey stuff to fit into the rest of the sequence. So that really is the toughest thing about an animal film, is being able to be in enough control to be able to separate every possible shot that you can do with the monkey alone and do them later after you send a lot of people home. So that was the trick that we used, and it was just very carefully storyboarded, and we, always knew the angles, always knew where his eyes needed to look, and that was the secret. But we were running around for weeks wearing Mexican hats, using noisemakers, trying to get the monkey to give us certain kinds of looks. A riot. It was amazing. It was an amazing experience.
Get away from me! Get away from me! Get away from me! You slime. You filth.
In 1993, Romero returned with the production of The Dark Half, based on a novel by Stephen King. The film starred Timothy Hutton and Amy Madigan.
Come on in here now. We're losing the light.
Why don't you just take a couple of that? No, don't forget. All right, okay.
Hey, come in near the stone. I'll just be a minute now.
Death, baby, don't look real.
What are these?
That's it. That's it.
George is a really kind of a maniac. He's a very strange, funny, gregarious guy. He's so smart. He's so well read. He's so funny, you know. And yet, you know, he's kind of been cast into this, you know, little pocket that he just does these kinds of films, you know. So it's interesting to me because I talk to him about politics and about his family and you know, all sorts of stuff. Just not like working on a Stephen King novel so much, you know. I personally am a Stephen King fan and have read all his books. When they come out, I get them. So I was so fascinated with The Dark Half because I mean, I believe it. I mean, there's this kind of, you know, your doppelganger somewhere in the world, you know, kind of skulking about. And oftentimes, to get to your creative side, you certainly are attracted not to the nice side of things. You're attracted to the darkness about that.
I mean, Steve and I have been friends for a number of years, and you know, every time something new comes out that he's written, I'm probably one of the first 10 people to read it. But I really, there's some of, how do you say this? Hey, Steve, forgive me. Some things that Steve writes, I find that I'm not particularly attracted to, or it's either not my style or my sensibility or whatever. But particularly the things that he has written about writing and writers and the process particularly attract me. And Dark Half I loved right away because, again, of the Jekyll Hyde theme and the idea of, you know, who are you when you're doing a creative work? Are you someone else? You know, I always think of the Sondheim, you know, the Sondheim song "Finishing the Hat," which is, you know, you're looking at the rest of the world through a window while you finish the hat, and it's. I think that study of that character, Thad Beaumont, in The Dark Half is he's just a wonderful character, and his alter ego, his dark twin, George Stark, is again just a terrifically drawn character. The way Steve wrote him, and I was very, very attracted to it, and right away.
It would be 7 years after the release of The Dark Half before Romero would return to feature filmmaking. It was during this period that he worked on developing a number of projects that never went into production. Then, in the year 2000, he completed his latest film titled Bruiser, about a man who one day wakes to find that his face is now a smooth, white, featureless mask. Freed by this newfound anonymity, he then seeks revenge on all who have wronged him.
Peter Grunwald was one of the producers on Monkey Shines, and he and I formed a partnership, Romero-Grunwald Productions. And right around the time of Dark Half, I guess I was a player. You know, I was getting a lot of offers. The phone was ringing a lot, Peter and I took a deal at New Line. It was a housekeeping deal, 2 years. We wound up having, you know, fancy offices, made a lot of money. They bought us a couple of properties, but never made a movie with us. And so all of a sudden, oops, you know, so your stock drops a little bit. And then we took a property out of that situation called Before I Wake, which then went to MGM and then later to Fox. And that was my project from hell. It was 6 years of development on this thing, and it never got made. After, you know, 40 drafts, 3 different writers, including myself. And so very, very frustrating. And in and around that same period, we were doing other sort of big Hollywood development things, and none of them ever happened. And, you know, when you don't show up for a while and you don't have a hit for a while, all of a sudden, you're not getting those phone calls as often anymore. So I went from finding it very easy to get in the office for the meeting and get a writing job, but a lot harder to actually get a movie greenlit. And horror at the point was sort of out. This was before the resurgence for Scream. Did Scream reawaken the horror genre? I guess you can say that. But it was a very, very frustrating, 7 years for me. I mean, just unbelievably frustrating. I was just making more money than I'd ever made because I was in these big development deals, Hollywood deals, studio deals. But all of a sudden they're cast dependent. And you have to, if Sharon Stone says no, the studio says, gee, I wonder if there's something wrong with the project, instead of saying, oh, well, we'll go to the next actress, there's this mentality, I think, around the studios. And it's, an experience, I think, probably counts less than youth these days. And so right now, it's harder for me to get something greenlit. But Bruiser has gotten, I finally went back, after I fled this sort of development hell of Hollywood and went back to trying a little film, a very personal little film, and found the Canal Plus French company was willing to finance it 100%. And it was like going back, to your hometown. It was like going back to a lovely little production where everybody cared about what we were doing. It was, $5 million, and so not that much at risk. And I just had a wonderful time. And luckily, since then, that film has, brought some attention back, and starting to get some of those phone calls again. But I'm working now with Stephen King again on a novel of his called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And so I feel like I'm back in the saddle, but it's a very frustrating experience. I mean, it's a business, and I can't fault these executives for the way they think or the way they behave. I think if there's anything to fault about the way the system works, is that there are very few people who are in authority positions who have not only a knowledge of the medium, but an affection for the medium. And I think that prevents a lot of work, a lot of good ideas and good projects from being made. I guess my plea to the American industry particularly is that they just let more stuff be made. And, don't think of the video invasion as an invasion, and think of it as an outlet for being able to do low-risk projects. There are a lot of filmmakers out there, big guys, guys that I know that have made $100 million movies that would die to be able to play at the $2 betting window. And, that's really what it's about. It would be wonderful if there was a place that you could go and say, hey, I have this little idea, and I just think it's lovely, and please give me a chance to make it. We've had censorship problems in other parts of the world. We were lucky enough to have UATC release the zombie films. As I say, Night of the Living Dead was before the MPAA. So it didn't have that, otherwise it probably at the time would have been an X. Day of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead would have been X's, but UATC decided to put them out without a rating and just a warning label on it. Now, there's still discrimination there. You can't advertise in certain newspapers. You can't advertise on primetime TV. You're basically treated as though you're an X-rated picture. But at least the movies got shown. In some countries, Nordic countries, and even in England, in Canada, where the censor board has a right to take a scissor to it, they did. But it's mainly the zombie films. None of the other stuff that I've done. Those are purposely meant to shock. The other stuff that I've done, I've really never had problems with. Martin, the MPAA wanted like 17 frames out or something. It was very painless.
He's also a really wonderful writer. A much better writer than anybody knows about. He's a very creative individual. He really has an ear for dialogue. He understands I think he really writes character great, storyline. But if anything sets him apart, I just think it's basically that he doesn't get a chance to work enough, do the things he wants to do.
He knows that if you have to have good drama and good tension, you have to go, you know, you don't go up, you go down. You know, and then you think that you've uncovered, you know, your evil. And he's like, no, let's keep going, you know. But he keeps a sense of humor about it, which is what I really appreciate about him. And there's always a political element involved in things, which I personally really like. And he kind of sneaks it in sometimes. I don't think people are quite aware of it. Certainly Night of the Living Dead. I mean, come on, just casting-wise. Had a black man in a film? Oh, my God. There was a white woman in there in the same room with them. I mean, you know, that was an amazing thing. That he just did. He didn't make a point of it, you know.
I haven't seen a lot of innovation in fantasy horror stuff. I mean, the resurgence in the genre, or what Hollywood calls a resurgence in the genre, is really just a restatement or a rehash of, you know, what John Carpenter did in the 70s for a new audience, I guess. So I haven't seen a lot of innovative work being done in the genre. And probably because Hollywood has a way of categorizing, particularly fantasy, horror, monster movies. You can either spend, you know, under 10 on it, or you can spend 150 and make it an event. And so I think most of the experimentation has been more with effects work and eye candy rather than content. So it had, you know, it hasn't been very exciting for me. Dario Argento's still doing some really interesting stuff. John's Carpenter's Vampires. You know, you see stuff every once in a while that has that sort of ecstasy about it, or you know that whoever made the movie is really having a good time and has an affection for what he or she is doing. But I haven't seen anything sort of groundbreaking. I don't know what the next movement is going to be. I don't know. It'll probably... so much has been done, and it's very hard to be afraid of things today. I mean, these people today, particularly young people, have seen so much in their lives and on the news that it's pretty hard to find something that's going to be disturbing.
As one critic wrote, at his best, Romero is, if not consistently a great director, then a director who sometimes makes great movies and others that are uncommonly interesting. Romero's contribution to American film is clear in his distinctive style and his consistent concern for strongly acted, suspenseful situations that place him among the better American directors in the genre he has chosen.
I don't think of my zombie films expressly as zombie films. I think of them as films that are stories about people that have, you know, a little bit of underlying satire or psychology in them that happen to be set in a situation where zombies are running amok. So I don't think of them as zombie films. I don't go into it, you know, and say, oh, this is going to... I don't think of it as a monster movie. I think of it much more as a movie about the characters that are in the thing. And the zombies are the threat, you know, whether the zombies are the birds or the zombies are the whatever the threat happens, the tidal wave, you know, the hurricane, more like that. I mean, it's very hard to say how you want to be remembered or how you want your work to be remembered. I guess, I guess in my heart, what I feel is that I've resisted certain temptations and at least up until now resisted just doing a project, you know, either for the money or because it was an obvious commercial thing to do. And I've always had... again, a conceit that, you know, it has to have some kind of a substance to it. It can't just be, you know, a guy running around with a knife or a gun and or a mask. And it has to have some sort of an underlying statement or theme, or, you know, because that's me. I mean, that's the reason I want to do this, is to try to express myself. not to, not to show you that I can glue a couple of images together and put a sharp sound on it and make you jump.